So before we actually start getting into the sculpting of the folds and surface detail, it's important that we create good base meshes to sculpt on. This can sometimes be the most tricky part, but you should also know that you don't need to rely on sculpt mode for most of it, or even sculpt some objects at all. So I'm just going to create a new collection for our clothing base meshes. The first base mesh creation method I'll be showing is extracting masks. This was in previous versions a lengthy manual process, or only available via add-ons. But I will be using the in-development version of Blender 2.81 from now on because of all the new features. The release is really a big one for any sculpting workflow. So for the sake of this tutorial not getting outdated soon, let's get into this. We'll start with the pants by masking out the area of the body where the pants are supposed to be. You can do this with the mask brush, but I recommend the lasso masking for this, since it masks through the objects and makes it easier to clearly draw an area where the mask will be. Remember to enable X symmetry to make this more efficient. As a little tip for navigation, you can hold down middle mouse button for navigation and then hold down Alt to automatically snap your view angle to the front, side and top views. What is less obvious is that you can use trackball navigation to tilt the viewport while keeping your view snapped onto one of these sides. It's a bit tricky to do and a bit awkward, but it can be very useful from time to time if you want to have, for example, the front, side or top views, but slightly tilted. Switching from perspective to orthographic view might also improve the masking results. Unfortunately, the lasso mask shortcut can only mask but not unmask. To unmask with it anyway, you're able to invert the mask with Ctrl-I, mask out some areas you don't want to have in the mask, and then invert the mask again. Alternatively, just use the lasso mask tool where you can hold down Ctrl to unmask areas. Once you're happy with the mask, go to Sculpt and choose the new option Mask Extract. There are a bunch of new tools and options, but this is the main one we'll be using right now. You'll get some extra options, but the default settings are usually fine. Most important is that you have Add Boundary Loop toggled on. Click on OK to start extracting the mask. After a couple to a few seconds, it should be done, and you will have a new object where your mask was. If you go into the Modifier tab in the Properties editor, you can see that the Mask Extractor automatically added a Solidify modifier to add some thickness to the new object. If you select the pants and use Local View on it, we can more clearly see the thickness. If we go into Edit mode and disable the Solidify modifier for the viewport, we can see the extra face loop that has been added around our previous mask. This has the purpose to make the result a bit smoother, since the mask itself can easily become extremely jagged, which can be very hard to smooth out. But since we have this extra loop, we can simply go into Sculpt mode and use the Smooth brush to smooth out the boundary edges. Just clear the mask we used previously first with Alt-M. Another navigation tip, click middle mouse button on any point of an object and the view will center on that surface point. This can be a very quick way of centering the thing you want to look at, zoom to, or rotate around. If we enable the Solidify modifier again, we can see the smoothed boundaries still cause some errors in the thickness, but these can be fixed later on. What we want to do now is to define the thickness a bit more. In the interface of the Solidify modifier, you can see the value slider that says Thickness to make the object thicker or thinner. If it doesn't say thickness, then that's probably because the Properties editor is too thin and doesn't have enough space to show the full name right now. You can also just click on the slider and type in a value of your choice. You can also use the Offset slider to the right to define where the middle point is, where the thickness is being drawn from. At 0, it's going to make the inner and outer side thicker to the same amount. Something closer to 0 will help you see the pants always on top of the body, since it will inflate the object slightly. But my personal recommendation is to pretty much always have it set to -1, once you really get into sculpting the surfaces. At -1, the thickness will only go inwards, and you will have the cleanest and most accurate surface outside as possible. But this is overall good for now. You can put the pants into local view again and smooth out the surfaces more in sculpt mode. But what I'll do instead this time, that I'll go into the Object tab in the Properties editor and enable In Front for the pants object. If you haven't done it yet, you can assign a shortcut or add it to the quick favorites by right-clicking on the toggle, if you tend to use this option often. Now we will see the pants always in front of the other objects, which is good enough for now. Use the smooth brush to smooth out the creases and deep valleys, since the cloth would naturally fill these in. What I also like to do is to use the clay brush and use a value of like 0.3 to 0.5 in auto smooth. This way I can add or subtract while flattening and smoothing the surfaces a little bit at the same time. This is a more efficient way of filling and smoothing valleys, and we'll eventually use it a lot when sculpting the folds. Now we'll sculpt away the deep creases. I'm also going to inflate the groin area a bit more and pull it down slightly. The butt area should also be smoothed a lot. Try not to add too much volume though. We'll try to make the pants pretty much tight to the body for now. Check in how it looks with the modifiers active as well. If the modifier is enabled while you are in sculpt mode, make sure that you have Use Deform Only enabled in the sculpt mode options. As I said before, this setting will disable most modifiers when entering sculpt mode to make sure that the performance doesn't become terrible. Also, don't worry yet about the width of the fabric. All of that will be addressed once we get into sculpting the folds and wrinkles. The only area where we could already address the width right now is the lower parts of the pants. We can imagine that the calves, being the widest spot in the area, is filling the width of the pants, but anything downwards from there will be roughly the same width then. So we can use the grab brush or inflate brush to adjust the thickness of the pants to get something closer to the width we want. Same story, but just a little bit for the knee. The boundaries are usually a bit tricky since they tend to bend inwards after grabbing or inflating them. Just keep adjusting and smoothing them and it will be fine. So this is the base mesh for the pants by extracting a mask. But let's continue with the second method, shrink wrapping. Set the 3D cursor to be somewhere central in the x-axis. In my case, I'll set it to the origin of the body. Next, we'll add a cube and scale it up to the width of the torso. Go into edit mode and add a loop in the middle. Then turn on X-ray to be able to select all the way through the object. Select one side and delete it. Then add a mirror modifier and enable clipping, as well as having merged enabled. As shown before, this way the vertices that meet in the middle will not just merge, but will stick to each other while in edit mode. Now select parts of the cube, move them into shape, and extrude the faces to get something closer to a shirt. Definitely have one circular loop around the neck or collar area. Also, delete the faces where the shirt should be open. Add a loop on the side and add a couple more loops to make the faces of the object more consistently square instead of rectangular or really stretched. We want a very evenly subdivided mesh in the end to sculpt on. Select the two faces on the shoulder and extrude them to create the sleeves. With the two faces on the sleeves selected, we can change them into a perfect circle in an easy way. If you have the Loop Tools add-on enabled in the preferences, you will have these extra options when bringing up the context menu. There we will click on the option Circle. This will rearrange the selection into a perfect circle. Now extrude the sleeve another time and add a couple more loops to make the faces more evenly square, just like before. Then select some loops and slide them to match the form a bit better to the torso. Ideally, you should delete the faces on the sleeves, which should be the open part, but I'll let them right now just to show you how to get rid of them if you forgot to delete them. So far it's very blocky, but now we get to add a couple more modifiers. Add a subdivision surface modifier through the modifier tab or by using the shortcut Control 1 to 4. 2 subdivisions should be good for now. Next, we'll add a shrink wrap modifier. Click the picker icon and pick the body. Now the object will be wrapped towards the body. Put the shirt on local view and we'll see the result more clearly. The shrink wrapping is not ideal yet, with many areas that are stretched, but I'll show you how to fix these. To get the best result for sculpting, you should use the project mode on the shrink wrap modifier, since it gives us some extra options. At first, it's going to look incredibly messy, but this is because it only wraps in the positive normal direction by default. Enable negative as well, and it should look much better. Still, some parts might wrap completely through the model onto the other side, so it's good to define a limit value as well. This will cap the distance any vertex can travel when wrapping to another surface. Also, set the snap mode to above surface to get more consistent snapping directions. The remaining issues can be solved another way. Apply the mirror modifier and the subdivision surface modifiers, and copy the shrink wrap modifier, which will duplicate it. Not the most ideal naming, but it's okay. Apply one of the shrink wrap modifiers. Now when going into edit mode, you have the shrink wrap result while still having the shrink wrap modifier active as well. Go into sculpt mode and smooth out the last problematic areas and generally try to distribute the geometry more evenly. This works best when the shrink wrap modifier is disabled for now, since it's also interfering with the brush behavior. If you now notice that the sleeves are still closed, you can go into edit mode, select those areas and delete them. One of the best ways to select the square patch of faces is to select one corner and while holding Ctrl and Shift, select the opposite corner of the square patch. It will then select that entire square patch from corner to corner. Alternatively, you could also just select one loop that goes around the arm. and delete it from there. Repeat the same for the other side of the shirt. Afterwards, you can just repeatedly smooth and inflate the end of the sleeve to get rid of the square profile. Always keep in mind that the smooth brush is also removing volume. That's why the inflate brush is so important to use afterwards. Enable the modifier again to see the result. If there's still some problematic areas, you can adjust the model more or copy and apply one of the modifiers again. If you try to sculpt on the objects while the modifier is still active, it can result in strange sculpting behavior, but you will get a more immediate visible result. Let's copy and apply it now. And to get some better shrink wrapping, I'm pushing the armpits a bit further inwards. Since we set the shrink wrap method to above surface, we can add some offset to gain some distance from the body. Set the shading to be smooth as well in the context menu. Apply the modifiers and add a solidify modifier for thickness. After defining the thickness, we can add some more subdivisions for a higher resolution to sculpt on and apply that one too. With this base mesh creation method, you will already have a smoother result based on your settings, and you will have a much better control on your edge flow and resolution. Meanwhile, with the mask extract method, you have to deal with the same resolution from the body, which might be pretty high, as in this case. Adjust the surface of the shirt a bit more to not have it intersect everywhere with the body. Use the clay brush for this ideally. To define the boundary of the sleeves a bit better, I can recommend the nudge brush. The brush is similar to the snake hook, but only moves geometry along the area plane, which means it only slides them along the surface, essentially. Make sure that the stroke method is set to dots for a better result while sculpting. Setting the strength value relatively low might also give you a bit more fine control. Since it's going to be a button shirt, we can model a bit more into it in edit mode. Select one of the center loops on the front that we want to rip. Then press V to rip the edge loop. Go to sculpt mode and pick the grab brush. If you grab the area where the edge loop was ripped off, it won't work by default. It will always grab both sides, even if they're disconnected. Also remember to disable X symmetry for now to see this better. Now, if we enable another new feature, which is the topological automasking in the brush options, then the brush will notice the separated geometry and it will only move one part of it. Now we can easily grab each side and separate the neck area a bit more to look more relaxed. To visualize the separation a bit better, we can go into the shading options for the viewport and enable cavity. For this, we only really need the valley slider to see the overlap. This will essentially give us a bit of an ambient occlusion effect. Just remember to disable the cavity shading once you don't need to see the overlap that clearly anymore, or if you're already able to see it clearly with, for example, the solidify modifier. Some extra shading options like cavity can slow down the performance of your viewport, but more importantly, they can give you a false impression of the curvature from your surfaces. In most cases, I like to keep this option disabled. I generally like to use the snake hook brush to grab and rotate areas slightly. Just make sure that the rake slider is set to 1 or at least something above 0, and that the rotation of the object is set to 0. otherwise the brush influence might be a bit weird. You can also use the new Pose brush to achieve this, or rotate the geometry in edit mode. At the point of recording this, the new tools and brushes don't have icons yet, unfortunately. So the brushes might look a bit differently at your screen. Once you have a few objects, you can switch to random colors in the shading options to make them more visible. The plan is to add some suspenders to the outfit, so the shirt needs to be tucked into the pants. You can quickly compare the boundaries of the shirt and pants when enabling in front on one of them or enabling X-ray shading. Push up the shirt so that it's roughly matching the boundary of the pants. The shirt and the pants are the main two pieces we're going to sculpt, but we still need some extra elements. We'll add those in the next video.